Welcome to another episode of Data Skeptic Animal Intelligence. Today on the show we're talking about the recent paper YouDream, generating anatomically controlled, consistent text to 3D animals. I'm going to chat with Becky about it in just a moment, and then we're going to have a two-part interview in which we're going to cover a couple of facets of this interesting project. It's a visual one, so you may want to go, even if you don't do this often, and look in the show notes for the link, or Google YouDream, all one word, and probably put YouDream 3D just to be sure. That'll get you the archive paper, which has the figures, or the Hugging Face page, or a bunch of other great links. Those visuals, first of all, are very cool looking, but also add a lot of context for this conversation. One last announcement to squeeze in before we kick off, and I gotta put a deadline on this now. Please do this by August 1st. We're looking for the next co-host for the next season. Specifically someone working in or related to graph theory. Could be social networks, Louvain community detection, graphs at scale, graph databases. It's a relatively small commitment, it's an on-air thing with some offline research, and it's a paid position. So if you're a graph theory person and this sounds interesting to you, send me an email to cohost@dataskeptic.com. Becky, I haven't given you the chance to hear today's interview first. I guess because, well, number one, just our scheduling, but two, it's more on the CS side. So I thought you and I could talk about some prerequisite points, maybe jargon that's in our field that won't be in all listeners' ears. The topic today, it's the process of converting 2D to 3D images using generative AI, although specifically in the domain of animals, rendering animals in a 3D format.
All right.
They have a novel reason as to why they focused on animals. Do you have a guess as to why?
Well, if you were doing, say, pictures of animals in the wild and you wanted to know how big they were, getting some kind of volume estimate from a picture could be cool.
You're on the right track. The challenge they face is there aren't very large collections of animal photos to work with. The diversity of species out there and diversity of creatures is much, much larger than the data sets that are commonly found. So, if you wanted to do something in computer vision that was about household items, you can almost certainly find thousands of photos of televisions and hairbrushes and the kind of things humans take pictures of. But we don't produce as many animal photos, so it's an added challenge for their group.
Okay, so this is sort of like photogrammetry without enough information.
Yeah, so they want to start from a 2D image, which you can generate with things like DALL-E or other, generative AI tools, but then utilize that and another technique where essentially it involves trying to kind of infer the structure of the animal and then ask the diffusion process to predict what that same image would look like from a different angle, given the pose, at least, of the animal.
But let's hear about diffusion. That's not a term I'm familiar with.
Yeah, so diffusion is sort of the key idea behind all of the generative image algorithms you'll see out there. The best way I have to describe it in, a 30-second kind of soundbite is that it's like learning how to undo the process of adding noise. So if you go into Photoshop or something like that and you say add noise to this image, it puts a little random distortion on every single pixel. And if you add just a tiny bit of noise, you can't even tell. If you add the maximum noise, you can no longer see the image. So imagine slowly but surely adding 1% noise, hundreds of times in a row. Eventually you've destroyed the image. But now ask computer vision to learn how to reverse that out. So take a good image and noisify it and say, here's the noisy version, here's the ground truth, try and predict what it's supposed to look like. And it effectively learns the process of denoising, but in a very intelligent way.
Okay, and I presume in Photoshop there's an algorithm for adding the noise. So in the use case you're describing, we don't know that algorithm when we're working backwards.
Not exactly. It's not a traditional algorithm where, I can write out the source code for it. It is a learned model.
Cool.
So it is still a mathematical function. We could look under the hood and say, what is it doing? We could describe it procedurally, but sort of in the language of linear algebra, not in a sort of novel sense like when you read binary sort and you understand what each of the lines of code does.
Okay.
So they've got and some pretty neat outputs. Actually, let me pull this up and I'll send you the picture or the paper in case you have any thoughts on the output they generate.
Let me check this out.
So the project is called YouDream, and really the core, there's a lot of novel things they've done, but the core is how we go from text to a 2D image and then process of converting that into a 3D object. On the second page of the paper, you can see a bunch of comparisons. Theirs is YouDream on the far right, and then for reference, what some other similar approaches are capable of producing.
Okay, so their llama has turned into an octopus.
At their request, a zoomed out photo of a llama with octopus tentacles body.
And then we also have a Pegasus-like giraffe, but with dragon wings.
Mm-hmm.
So that's worked pretty well. Okay, so I see some things I really like these creatures have the correct amount of wings, legs, and presumably tentacles.
I do see one lion that's not quite right.
That's true.
In fact, he looks like he's in pain.
But definitely I've seen a lot worse. So this is fascinating.
Yeah, they have some really novel ML techniques that we get into during the interview. And while they're exhibiting the more fantastic ones that, might appear in a sci-fi movie, I think the technique could just as well produce maybe not scientific quality specimen images, I don't think like that, but for, movies or documentaries or those sorts of things, it may be possible to start generatively doing some high quality three-dimensional objects of animals.
Yeah, I'd love to, instead of a text input, let's say we had 3D scans of all mammals and birds, just vertebrate animals that are in museum collections, just their skeletons. And we were able to reproduce no feathers, no fur, just the skin on top of those animals, because we already know what they look like. They're living today. I'd love to create a training data set like that and then generate a 3D model of, say, dinosaurs using just the articulated skeletal material, which is in this ballpark, but not exactly the same as what they're doing.
So there's something interesting here. It's too far afield for me to comment very well on, but for sure there's a mathematical way of describing how muscles map onto bones.
Yep.
And I'm sure that's maybe different in different parts of the tree of life, but we know the parts of the tree of life where dinosaurs are from and their descendants. So there is information here from which I think an algorithm could help infer better fossil towards, structure and body type that maybe human beings are kind of just doing loosey-goosey now.
Right. And I think there's a whole branch of paleontology that deals with this sort of biomechanics, and there's already software that can help you simulate muscles if you know where the insertion points are and that kind of thing. But I get the feeling that machine learning could do it a lot more holistically and better.
Yeah, there's definitely a big opportunity there. Well, and the other opportunity that they corner on in this is that 2D to 3D stuff. What's kind of cool is the output is an actual 3D object that you can import into a lot of popular softwares. So it's a true kind of digital artifact that gets produced.
Nice. Does it produce a really good mesh, or is it something artists would need to clean up?
So I think that's something we should ask an artist. The impression I got, I didn't ask that exact question, but I think it's pretty close that these are fairly stylized meshes, although I would imagine different projects have different house styles and things like that. So that's another step of how do you maybe start from this base and infer something along those lines.
Cool.
Well, let's jump right into the interview.
I am Sandeep Mishra. I am a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin. I work with Dr. Alan Bowick, doing my PhD in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. So I primarily work in the domain of image and video quality assessment. This paper, YouDream, is an introductory paper for me to get into the domain of generative AI. And moving forward, I would like to get into the quality assessment of generative content.
When it comes to image and video quality, could you elaborate on that? How do you measure that quantitatively?
Typically, it's used in cases where people are communicating through images and videos. For example, you watch videos on Netflix, YouTube, Amazon, and when you have a lower bandwidth, you generally get content which is not in its best quality, like we say HD quality, high clarity, ultra HDR. So we measure these kinds of metrics and provide feedback as to how to improve it, given there is a drop in the bandwidth or your internet connection is poor. In those cases, you tend to see artifacts in the videos, and we try to measure these quantities and use them as a feedback to improve and provide better quality of the content at a lower bandwidth as well.
Well, all of these features then prevent a form of feedback. Where does that feedback go?
So this feedback is typically used in deciding the parameters that are used in encoding and decoding. So every time a video is shown to you on the phone or on the laptop, it is decoded from its compressed state. So this process itself creates issues. And similarly, like you have encoding processes as well. So every time you edit a video, or you upload a video to some platform, they encoded it using their own parameters. So these parameters are tweaked based on the feedback provided by the quality metrics.
Well, it seems like you could have a whole career, a very rewarding one, just working on this problem. What got you interested in also looking at generative video?
Yeah, hi, I'm Oindrila. I'm a PhD student at UMass Amherst at the CS department. I'm working with Professor Subhranshu Maji and Professor Grant Van Horn. I am mostly focused in learning from limited and imperfect data across different modalities, say text, image, 3D, etc. Currently, I've been focusing on the natural domains such as animals, all kinds of natural things like insects, fungus, and representing them more through AI models, which usually lack in these domains currently.
And when you talk about limited and imperfect data, could you expand upon that? What can be limited and what can be imperfect?
Sure, yeah. Actually, it's like a huge umbrella term. So I have been doing multiple projects. Earlier, I have been working on learning, say, segmentation from indirect data sources, such as suppose I have only key points of an animal, or I have only the background foreground segmentation, and I want to learn part segmentation. So this is an example, like we have different type of annotation sources which are easier to annotate, and we try to learn a very difficult AI model using that. So currently with my most recent project, YouDream, it's about learning using only 2D data, like learning a 3D model using only 2D data.
Well, with an interest in animals, and as you'd mentioned, it's not that there aren't data sets of animal images, they're just quite limited. Can you speak to what is available and how you can make best use of it?
I think the most traditional data sets that these foundation models use, for example, Lion 5B, they have mostly it's about objects or humans. Humans are very well represented, so doing human key point detection or human tracking or human detection in general is very easy because we have a lot of data of humans, but not so much of animals in these data sets. There are data sets such as iNaturalist, which have like say 2. I think it has the latest.
So my name is Scott Laurie, and I'm the executive director of iNaturalist. Since we started the program, we now have about 190 million observations.
And all of them are not animals. There are plants, lot of plants and lot of insects and stuff. So iNaturalist is, I think, a good step towards the representing the natural flora and fauna. But it is still not at the level of these huge data sets that we have of image caption pairs. For example, iNaturalist still does not have image caption pair style of data sets which we can use to learn one of these foundation models. So there are still limitations to what is out there in natural domains, but for normal domains like humans and objects, there are a lot of data set with lot of annotations, like different kinds of annotations. So those problems, they are very easy to solve. Like for example, generating 3D humans is very easy and is always consistent, but generating 3D animals is not so much.
Well, it seems like you could have a whole career, a very rewarding one, just working on this problem. What got you interested in also looking at generative video?
So generative video, as you know, is like a very hot and upcoming topic, especially considering for me, it's a career in itself, the topic of image and video quality engineering, which it is actually. So many of my alumni from the lab, that I work in are already in the industry doing pioneering works in these domains, improving the quality of the video that people get to watch, improving the quality of the images that people get to share on social media. This itself is kind of, I wouldn't say saturated, but it's already a very well, thoroughly researched domain. And the research goes on improving with the state of the art processes of compressing and decompressing videos. The reason why I wanted to go into generative AI is because people have started coming up with great ideas to create great content using generative AI, but there is no hard defined metric that can figure out exactly what is the quality of a generative output, especially given the fact that there is no ground truth. Like, it's all generative. It's all generated by the computer. It's all generated by algorithms, and there is no ground truth to compare it to.
Maybe we could take a step back and talk sort of about your generative goals. Like if it's to create a 3D image of a dog, for example, I mean, that's an interesting demonstration, but what was the breadth of what you were looking to generate?
So the reason why we choose animal generation is because most of these models, especially the generative models, they are trained on huge data sets of either 3D, existing 3D models or 2D images. And in both cases, the majority of the images do not belong to living organisms. They belong to inanimate objects, cars, buildings, apple, fruits, and vegetables and stuff like that. So in most of the cases, because the data set consists largely of these kinds of inanimate objects, the model basically learns probabilistically to estimate that domain. So in this case, because you have larger probabilities of inanimate objects, the model tends to perform better on inanimate objects. When it comes to animals, models tends to generate wrong outputs, I would say, because they contain artifacts such as extra legs, extra tails, maybe inconsistent anatomical aspects such as the legs being too long or too short, or the face being inaccurate, the eyes not being in the correct positions, like one eye below the other or something like that. This arises because of the fact that these animate objects or animals have a low probability in the actual data that was used to train. While doing this project, we tried to find out every existing animal database that provides images of animals and some associated features such as key points. We found that there are very few such data sets. We were able to find, I guess, 4 data sets that consist in animals and their key points. The key points I refer to here are such as eyes, nose, shoulders, elbows, same for the feet, and these kinds of points that are annotated by humans. Even for humans, there are data sets that have about 200k, 300k such annotated images. But for animals, you only have about 30, 40k images. As you see, animals are not represented well in these databases. And because they are not represented well, the trained models, the deep generative models that are trained by even large companies, tend to have a lower representation of animals. And once you have a lower representation of animals, the models do not generate good results. So that was the core reason why we decided to create animals, so that we can show that you can create animals without using larger databases. All it needs is that you need to have a smart way of representing those animals and to make the models generate outputs according to what we want.
And could you describe some of the first images or, I guess, 3D models produced?
So the first iteration of 3D training, we saw that it was not able to work well for occlusions. We saw that when there were samples which had some, say, part of the leg occluded, it would create an unrealistic looking image. Like, so we could see the image being created at every iteration rather than just seeing the final 3D asset at the end. So that's how we figured out that there needs to be something in our control net training which accounts for the occlusion so that we don't face this problem. So there was this thing that the elephant that we were trying to make, it always had like grass at its legs. There was this problem we were always getting. That I think was one of the earlier problems that we faced.
Could it be that your data set strictly is limited in that way, that all elephants appear standing in grass?
Yeah, that's true. That's why like we have to play with the prompt a bit. Our data set is about, I guess, 30,000 images or so, which is a very small data set to train control net in. We are mainly relying on the information that stable diffusion has inherently. So stable diffusion surely has seen elephants not standing on grass. So we have this another parameter that we tweak. So we can scale the control. We can have our trained model with higher weight at the starting and then shift the control to stable diffusion at the ending. There's a slider we can tune so that the end of the slider is basically our control net and the other end of the slider is stable diffusion. So we can shift the behavior of the model that we have from our control net to the stable diffusion. Otherwise, because our data set is only animal images, so we will not be able to create these crazy things such as lizard wearing a crown or things like that. That can't be created because our small data set only has like realistic wildlife images. So to get that kind of balance, we have this extra parameter where we tune between our control net to stable diffusion.
Thanks to our newest sponsor, math.fashion. Yes, that is a real URL. Visit math.fashion and check out their line of mathematics-themed t-shirts. They sent me the Klein Bottle shirt, which is pretty stylish. I've gotten a few compliments about it, and each one is the opportunity to start a long conversation about two-dimensional manifolds. Get more math in your life, specifically on your body. Visit math.fashion. Well, you've made your life more difficult with this choice. If you had picked something more common, then probably the traditional methods of machine learning would have worked off the shelf. Could you talk about some of the innovations you had to bring to the table given the sparseness of your data?
Definitely. So we started out by understanding what was lacking. So in this case, we figured out that there is no way to make the generative model predict consistent outputs for every views. So we figured out that we would need something of a control net type to control the network to generate output of the same animal from different views. So in this case, we found that the best way to do that for any animal is to understand its skeleton. To represent a skeleton, as I mentioned, we use these key points such as eyes, ears, and nose, along with the rest of the key points from the body, such as elbow, wrist, hips, points from the legs, such as knees, foot, and we create a skeleton out of it by joining the appropriate points. Once you have a skeleton, especially if you have the skeleton in 3D space, and you can you can use cameras to capture views of this skeleton from different angles. And if you can somehow make the network generate outputs that adhere to these skeletons from their respective views, then most definitely the output will be consistent for all the views. So to do this, we first train a control net that takes as input a given pose of an animal and generates the animal in that pose. So the pose could be anything. For example, like an elephant looking towards you. So in that case, the output of the control net, the output of the model, generative model, should be an elephant looking towards you, and the pose is also looking towards you. Because the pose and the output are aligned, now we are sure that the model will generate consistent results for every pose that I give it. So in this case, we start out with a 3D pose. We create a 3D pose. We take multiple pictures of the 3D pose from different angles. We provide that to the control net. The control net generates the same animal in those different poses from different angles. And once we have those images, we basically lift them to 3D using using the different views that we have. So to train a control net, what we did was we collected data sets that have animal key points already annotated in them. We need annotated data to train a model to understand that if this is a given pose, then how should the output look like? So because we have the key points, we create the skeleton of the animal, we provide that skeleton to the control net. And because we already have an output image corresponding to that skeleton, we compare the output of the control net with that ground truth image and force it to produce the same output every time.
What kind of results do you see using sort of off-the-shelf techniques, specifically with animals? Because as you said, the human generation is maybe easier because the data sets are so good. Do the current systems produce something grotesque, or what kind of results do you see?
Yeah, there is this Janus head problem, which is very famous and it's very problematic for everyone. Where suppose you're generating an elephant, you will see either two heads or two tusks, or like the head placed in a way where it does not make sense with the rest of the body, or the tail becomes a head too. So these kind of things, like basically, which happens because, so if you say, for example, if you say side view of an elephant, it could be either the left side view, it could be either the right side view, and you cannot give the proper angle or how the animal is. Is it looking at the camera? Is it looking away from the camera? So these things are something which are not able to be controlled in a fine-grained manner using only text. At a single camera location, you will get very different outputs from 2D diffusion models. And all of them will result in inconsistencies where you see multiple heads. So it thinks that a head should be at the front of the animal, at the side of the animal, and it becomes like a huge mess.
To many people, the current models are sort of a black box. You can put in your prompt and maybe you get out a result you do or don't like. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the engineering process? How do you get under the hood and where are you plugging in and tinkering?
I guess I would start with diffusion models. So diffusion models, you give them a noise and they will iteratively refine it to a realistic looking image. So we basically take a off-the-shelf diffusion model to guide our 3D generation process. I think the main thing to note is that in our method we have no 3D data that we use, no 3D objects. We purely learn our 3D object using only 2D information. Given a 3D pose, from different cameras we snap 2D views of it. So we get a set of 2D pose images, control images, let's call it. We can use these pose images to control what image can be generated from a diffusion model. There's this thing called control net, which takes input control or condition image, which can be pose, sketch, and edges. In our case, we use pose because it is easy for humans to make pose compared to, say, edges or sketches. So in our case, the control net takes in a 2D pose and predicts an image for that pose given a text. So say I said a brown horse and I give a side view 2D pose of a brown horse. So it will give me an image of how a brown horse will look for that specific pose. So given that image, now that information will be back propagated to my 3D model, which is represented using a NUF, a neural radiance field in this case, and which gets updated iteratively across, say, 10K, 5K, 15K iterations to finally form the 3D asset. So at each iteration, I am getting a small indication as to how a brown horse should look like from a 2D diffusion model. And I'm updating my 3D model, the NUF, using this information.
And are you then assembling them? Is this is the output a video that you can review?
Oh, not really. The final output is actually a NERF. So what we do is we use a 3D NERF, which is nothing but a three-dimensional space. So imagine like a cube, 1x1 of size 1x1x1. So that's a unit cube. And you are basically trying to fill in every point in the unit cube with what exactly it should look like. When you're training the model or training the NERF, basically in this case, what you do is you look at the NERF from a certain camera angle, and that is the decided camera angle for this instance. You basically pass that NERF into a diffusion model, the view of that NERF into a diffusion model, and the diffusion model predicts how it should look like from that angle. And once you have that prediction, you backpropagate that and try to figure out what the pixel at that nerve or the voxel at each point of that unit cube should look like. So it's actually a 3D asset that we generate. The outputs that you see on our website are actually videos of the 3D asset being rotated.
So that 3D asset in its binary form, is there a formal file format? Like, could I load that into one of these 3D programs?
Oh, definitely. So we create OBJs. These are 3D objects. You could convert them to different formats as well that are also compatible with all of the softwares. OBJs are also compatible with almost all softwares, and you can load them anywhere. You can also rig them. You can attach skeletons to them. We already have a skeleton, so rigging them is even more easier. So once you rig them, you can attach animation sequences to the rigs and then make those 3D objects move.
So is it fair to say that the distillation process is putting the flesh on your skeleton?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, definitely. So the distillation process does exactly that. It puts voxels on top of the skeleton that we provide and creates this final 3D mesh for you that you can use anywhere else.
So when we were talking about quality earlier, I was thinking of when I'm on like a not very good video conference and it's glitchy and there's rectangles and frozen frames and stuff like that. But when I think about quality in generative images, they're rarely glitchy. It's how well did I get what I wanted from my prompt. Are these two entirely different meanings of quality, or is it the same thing to you?
It's not exactly the same thing, but it's an extension. Typical quality metrics such as how glitchy it is, or are there any frame drops, are there any blocky artifacts or not. These kind of questions are definitely going to remain the same in case of generative AI as well. But at the other end, because it is generative AI, it could predict anything, whether it is aligned to the prompt or not, whether it is realistic or not, whether it provides the correct information that was asked in the prompt or not, even though it may align with the prompt well, such as, for example, an elephant kicking a ball. In that case, if the elephant's feet are touching the ball, if it looks like it's kicking or not, if it looks like just the ball is kept far away from the elephant, the ball and elephant are both there in the picture, and most of the models will tell you that it aligns well with the prompt. But from a human perspective, it might look like the elephant is not playing with the ball. The ball is just kept somewhere far away from the elephant. So that's where we come in and try to understand how well the prompt is aligned with the image or the generated output.
So I know that if I went to one of the commonly available text-to-image generators, something like DALL-E, and I say something simple like give me a 3D room with a red square in the middle, it can probably do it, but it's doing it in a flat 2D sort of way. I don't believe that it has any notion of 3D or a formal like that everything has the vanishing point or that kind of stuff. When you think about 3D generative, are you thinking of a more sophisticated model than DALL-E?
Definitely. So a 3D generative model should ideally be able to understand the physics of the surroundings along with generating accuracy to the prompt. But apart from that, there are other problems to solve, such as figuring out whether you can do something like that without actually invoking the physics. We try to not use 3D generative models because the major problem with 3D generative models is that you would need huge amounts of data to train, which does not exist as of now. Because of this lack of data, we as computer research scientists, we try to find out ways where we can use less amount of data or existing larger databases from other domains and try to bring in that information from other domains and build 3D on top of it without actually using the physics.
Interesting. Could you talk more about that process?
If you were to, let's say, build a generated asset of an elephant, you could use a 3D model that knows how an elephant would look from every given angle. And then using that trained model, you can generate this 3D asset. But in case you do not have a 3D asset of an elephant to learn from, it's impossible to do that. In that case, what we do is we use 2D image generative models and we guide them to generate images of an elephant from every different possible angle. And then we use those multiple images to concatenate into one 3D space. So how the human vision works is if we see the same thing from different angles, we can predict or rather understand the depth. And once we understand the depth, we understand the 3D effect that it brings on. Similar to that, when you use a text to image model, which is in a 2D space, you tend to create 2D images of the same thing from different angles. And once you do that, you try to understand the 3D depth from it and then create the final 3D asset. This is a very top level explanation. And as we move on into the podcast about the paper, I will be describing how we do that exactly in this paper.
And then is that a controlled thing? Do you maybe take one image from each of 360 degrees around it? Or what's the process to inform the 3D model?
Because we cannot take every, it is like taking all types of camera angles is too much and it's too dense. So we just randomly sample a batch size of camera angles. It's, I think, about 32 in our case. We place the camera with random azimuth and random distance and then snap a photo of the 3D pose.
So then I can see how all those angles would help inform the 3D pose, or at least the predicted model. How do you evaluate the quality of what you develop? There is no real ground truth here. How can we tell the goodness of the model?
There are multiple ways people do this. There are these foundation models, which I talked about again. So there are these text image foundation models, which are able to tell you how close the close up given image is to a text. So that is something which people use. There's this clip model where, say, I have 3 different generated assets, all of 3 from different methods. And I will snap images of those models from different camera angles, which are predetermined. Say I snap 18 camera shots of all of these 3 assets. And then I will assess how close they are to the text that I gave as input to my model to make this 3D asset. And then I can average this out and find a final score as to where does each of these 3 assets stand. So in this case, we see that we improve from our previous baselines. This is not like the main thing of our method, because clip models, they can very easily give higher score to anatomic inconsistencies, because it mostly just sees whether a similar looking object is present in the image or not. So the clip model will not be able to understand if there are anatomic inconsistencies. So in our case, what basically shown is that the human study, where we have about 25 to 30 assets, and we ask human subjects to rate them based on different types of factors, like how real it is or how consistent it is, things like that.
Well, one thing that occurs to me, and maybe you've tried this, but I'm sure you've seen the movie The Matrix and its famous camera where it does the 360 rotation. I guess everybody uses that now. Could it be as simple as asking DALL-E to replicate one of those camera 3D moves around a particular image?
You can definitely ask it to generate, but the thing is that it won't. It won't generate consistent views for every angle, which is where the problem is, because it doesn't understand 3D. To make it generate consistent views, you need to provide some sort of control, or you need to provide some sort of details into the model while you provide the input so that it can generate consistent outputs. So in this case, we use a control net to provide control signals as to how to generate consistent outputs.
What does the control net consist of?
To answer that question, I will begin by explaining what the exact model is. So the model is basically defined as the diffusion model in this case. It's a process where you try to denoise an image, and basically to denoise an image, you try to predict the noise. So in this case, the model typically consists of a unit model. A unit model is where there is an encoder which takes an input, reduces it down to some features, and then there is a decoder which extracts information from the reduced compressed space and recreates the output. So in this case, the control net is basically an extra encoder that is appended alongside the original encoder, and the outputs of the original encoder and the control net encoder are mixed, and provide it to the decoder to create the final output. So the control net is basically a side signal or a meta signal that is provided to the main model to control the output.
Is this an original framework or is this something established in the literature?
It is established pretty well in the literature. Many people have used this. There is a complete paper on ControlNet, which provides or which shows the various types of inputs you can provide to the ControlNet to generate the desired output. For example, you can use something like a pose structure, which defines the skeleton of a human. You can use normals meaning how the light reflects from each point on the object. You can use sketches as well. So you draw a sketch and then you provide that as an input and you ask it to generate an output image describing the sketch. So if, for example, if I want an image of a dog, I just sketch a dog in very simple lines and then I provide it as an input to the control net, and it ends up creating a dog almost exactly fitting into the sketch.
Could you speak a little bit to the control network? Were there any novel ways you had to fine tune or regularize or shape it to work in your situation?
In our first iteration of 3D training, we saw that there will be a lot of camera samples which are very different from the data distribution that we are training in. Like the 2D data sets of key point image pairs that we have, they usually have the animal centered, like a very ideal situation. But when we are taking camera samples to make the 3D pose, we want to be able to speak for every kind of crazy camera position that can be sampled, and we want to know how the animal will look from any kind of camera sample that we are using. So what we do during control net training, that is something novel that we do, is introduce in some augmentations like rotations, translations, so that the animal is not centered into the image, and we are able to speak for a higher distribution of animal poses in that way.
Could you talk about some of the engineering efforts that go into building something like this?
Like we actually did it in a pretty small amount of time, but took a lot of hours to understand. So this was something which both of us, it was the first time we were working in something in 3D. So there was a lot of time to understand what goes into these models. There are so many different types of nerves that you can choose from. There are so many different types of resolutions that you can choose from. And given in academia, we have very limited resources. So we have to decide what is the best way for us to, learn these things. And if you were in industry, you just take the biggest nerve and you can just train it on large GPU clusters. But in our case, we had to kind of balance that to the computation expensive and how good the model looks. First few weeks was basically just understanding what limitations the previous methods have and how to just get a better quality. I think a lot of engineering went into it. And then we saw that engineering is not enough to get the best quality of animals, because there is fundamentally wrong theoretical concepts that are being used by previous methods. So I think that's where our research novelty came in.
Earlier, you'd also mentioned doing some work with insects and fungi.
Right.
Could you discuss that? Are there any interesting things? I'm sure some overlap, but maybe some unique features of those particular areas.
So we basically have a clip model again, the text image model which we use for zero shot classification, and we fine tune that using iNaturalist and LLM generated descriptions of different categories. Say you have this Western girl and you ask the LLM to give out characteristic features of Western gull which can be used to differentiate it from other birds. So we get purely textual information based on that, and we can use that to get weakly aligned data set, again limited and imperfect data, I guess. Weakly aligned data set to fine tune clip for zero shot classification. And currently I am working with iNaturalist to have a better explainable model. Currently in iNaturalist, users put in an image of an organism, and Their AI identifies, like gives a top 5 prediction as to what can there be in the image. So we want to create a simpler process where we have a chat interface which tells the user about the image that they have put. Is that image enough to identify the organism that is being shown? Or does the user have to take a better image of the organism? For example, the beak of the bird should be visible to identify correctly whether that bird is a Western gull. So that is something what I'm working on currently. So basically bringing in the text into iNaturalist. What all I talked about right now, it expects a 3D pose as input from the user, but sometimes people do not want to make that effort, and you would say, just for example, just like for a brown horse, you would expect that the AI should know what the brown horse is, and you don't have to draw the skeleton of the brown horse. You don't want to get into the effort of drawing the skeleton of the brown horse. So in that case, we have a method to automatically generate the 3D pose of an animal. We have a very small limited library of about 16 animals, and we have a multi-agent LLM setup, a large language model setup. So we have three agents of LLMs, which is the finder, the observer, and the modifier. So the finder LLM, basically say you want to make a horse and you tell the LLM that, yeah, I want to make a horse, give me a skeleton of a horse. The finder LLM will then go and find the closest animal to horse in our library. Let's say it's giraffe. So the finder LLM will say that giraffe is the animal which is closest to horse in our library, and you can use the pose of giraffe, modify it and make it into a horse. So then we fetch the pose. Then the observer LLM basically suggests edits to the giraffe's pose so as to make it into a horse pose. And then the modifier LLM uses these observations and then puts these edits into the 3D pose in the 3D space for the giraffe pose and makes it into a horse pose. This is basically a automated platform for making the pose, 3D pose of any commonly found animal that you want to make. And also this setup also takes the action. For example, I can make a bear running or a horse standing, so you can also give like a small pose description of the animal that you want to make.
How much effort goes into prompt engineering for a project like that?
Yeah, I think about few iterations, like 15 to 20 iterations of mostly the second LLM, I would say, where it's probably the most crucial LLM which has to understand the 3D space that our key points are in. So you have to give it some context, like the bones, basically the nose is joined to the neck is joined to the back and things like that. And then you have to give it some 3D context, that where is the animal facing? It's facing towards the positive y-axis. The height can be changed based on the length of like the distance between the leg key points. We actually provide a long context to this LLM so that it's able to understand the 3D space and is able to make the correct suggestions for edits.
I think that's a clever way of chaining these together. Is that a technique that's novel in this case, or were you guys inspired by other places?
No, it is completely novel. So we do have a related work survey in our paper, and we do not find any other work who have done 3D pose manipulation using LLMs. So this is the first time we show that.
And can some of the lessons we talked about earlier, like natural scene statistics, can we apply some of those for, I don't know if it's evaluation or regularization, but leverage those techniques at this stage?
To some extent, but not completely. To use such natural scene statistics, at the end of the day, you would need some sort of ground truth to compare it to. In typical cases such as normal 2D videos and images, what we do is we conduct an in-lab human study where we invite people who come and sit inside the lab. They sit in front of a computer, they view videos, and at the end of each video, they rate the quality of the video. The instructions given to these subjects is that all you have to do is watch the video and then rate the video based on how much you liked the quality of the video, not the content of the video, but just the quality of the video, whether it was blurry, whether it has any artifacts. Based on that, you can give it a lower score. And if it does not, then you give it a higher score. Once we have a significantly large enough database of such rated videos, we then compile the scores for each video because we show each video to multiple people. We compile them into one single score. We call it a mean opinion score for that video. And then we train models, even models such as natural scene statistics, which give you statistical features of an input to these ground truth opinion scores. And once that bridge or mapping is complete from the features to the scores, you then have a model that can predict the quality. So in this case, what we need is we need to conduct large human studies where we show people these generative outputs and then we ask people to rate them. And then we compare the natural scene statistics with these mean opinion scores to figure out what the quality is. So we did a similar kind of study for the paper as well. We generated outputs from our model. We also generated outputs from various other models that exist in the research space currently. We showed all of them to people one by one. In each frame, they were able to see 5 examples, one of which was ours and 4 of which were from competing methods. They were asked to choose which one looks the best. And based on that, YouDream turned out to be the best looking output in most of the cases.
Is Hollywood about to start using this technology?
Actually, they do. They do use many of the existing research outputs that are created in the research academic industry. I'm not sure, like you mentioned Matrix. So the VFX of Matrix was provided by Paul Debevich. He was one of the pioneers of visual effects. He worked at USC and he developed many such things regarding generation of 3D humans, 3D lighting, how to control lighting in a 3D scenario. And they already use it in many cases where they create 3D recreations of the scene and then modify it and then re-record the whole thing in a computer instead of actually going and re-editing or recreating a shot. Many people have already asked me about, so I presented this was a part of this work at the CVPR conference, and many people were interested in using something like this in the industry. But for that, most definitely you would have to need to have a very good software setup where you can do everything in a single flow. As of now, the current code, it's a bit easy for programmer to use, but it's definitely not easy for a non-programmer kind of person to mix all of the components of the method. Typically, in this case, what you would do is you would create a 3D pose. To create a 3D pose, you would need a tool where you can visualize the key points in 3D space and move those 3D key points around and create the desired pose that you want. And then once you have the pose, you transfer it to another computer where your model is running and you provide that 3D pose to the model. The model then rotates the 3D pose, gets views from different angles, and then finally generates the 3D asset. So the process itself takes around 1 hour, less than 1 hour to complete. Most probably people who are accustomed to programming, they can very well use it to create a rough format of whatever asset they want to generate. On our website, we show a Venom horse. As you know, the recent Venom movie is going to come out and they have in their trailers a horse which is captured by Venom. It looks magnificent. We tried to recreate it using our method. The only thing that we had to do, we had to change the pose of the horse. We already have a horse in our library, so we had to change the pose of a horse to look like the Venom horse. So yeah, we made the pose changes and then we provided it to the model and it generated a Venom horse for us.
Fabulous. We're going to have a deep link to specifically that video in the show notes so listeners can go and find it. I know just the paper and some of the examples you built are a milestone in and of themselves, demonstrating the techniques. Maybe this is kind of the deliverable, but I'm curious if you see any future or next iterations along these lines.
The thing is that we do not claim that we produce the best quality outputs in terms of how well the mesh is or how great the colors look. Currently, we primarily focus on the anatomical consistency the perfections of the anatomy of the animal. So we make sure that the animal does not have 5 legs if it was not supposed to have 5 legs. But because it's a pose based thing, in case you want to have an animal with 5 legs, you create a pose with 5 legs and you provide it as an input and it generates an animal with 5 legs. So I'm not sure if you're aware of the Wampus cat. We were able to build that as well. The Wampus cat has 6 legs and it's basically like a tiger with 6 legs. Yeah, we were able to generate that, but it was not by sheer luck. Existing models that do not have any control, they can generate as many legs as they want, as the model wants, not the user wants. So that's where we come in. We provide control so that you can generate exactly what you want. But there is scope of quality improvement where the individual pixels or the voxels look crystal clear to the human eyes. And if the quality can be improved, then most definitely people would jump to use something like this, even in the movie industry.
Absolutely. It's really exciting about what we might be seeing coming down the lines from the results of work like this.
As far as I understand, the pipeline involves something like this, that multiple artists start working on the same, say, for example, you want to create Thanos. So to create Thanos, multiple artists would try to create parts of Thanos and they would all combine together to create the final 3D asset of Thanos. In this case, the creation of the 3D asset can be aided by something like our paper. And once you have that, you can then start working on refining it rather than starting from scratch.
What's next for you? Obviously, you're finishing up your PhD, but can you talk about any plans you have beyond that?
So I'm actually confused as every PhD student would be about what to do after PhD, whether it's a job, whether it's something such as being a professor, or in my case, I would like to build something of my own. So as you said, maybe take YouDream to the next stage and create it as a tool provided to the community of VFX creators and see their feedback, build a company on top of that. And that would be something I guess I would be interested in doing.
Well, yeah, common answer that at your point, there's a lot of opportunities to be considering. So good luck whichever path you go down.
Thank you so much.
What's next for you?
So I guess multiple things. So as I said, I would like to have a fast way to animate these assets, which is I think still an open area of research. Working with iNaturalist, I'm excited about that project. We have a huge data set of image caption pairs, which I would like to explore what all we can do using that. So that is another interesting domain for me.
And along the lines of animation, are there any particular techniques you can hint at that are useful in that effort?
For human pose animation, there are these methods where they rig the skeleton to a predefined parametric model. But for animals, the parametric model that we have is not able to represent very different kinds of animals like crocodiles or birds. But existing work in human animation, there has been a lot of work in human animation. So they usually latch on to a predefined parametric model, which you can easily do for humans because all of us are shaped almost the same way.
Do you think there's a near-term opportunity for movie studios to take advantage of research like yours?
Yeah, sure, definitely. So I think once we are able to make a better, we are trying to improve the quality of the assets we are generating. But yeah, I think the main focus of this work was give more control to the artists. So now what happens is that you just put in your text into the model and you just pray that it makes something nice. But now you can draw your own 3D pose and you can give more control to the 3D artist. So I think that will be very useful in the near future for making different kinds of imaginary assets, especially. So I think it took a lot of time for us to come up with creative assets. For example, we created these llama with octopus tentacles body. It's something you'd see in a movie probably. So those kind of things, like these imaginary creatures, I think they can be made only using our method. So I would love it if if people are able to use it in their while making 3D assets.
Very cool. Maybe video games as well.
Yeah, of course.
Oindrila, is there anywhere listeners can follow you online?
Maybe Twitter. I have a Twitter handle. It's Windy_Saha.
Hi, yeah, my Twitter handle would be Sandy_UTA.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be there.